In the ancient archives of memory, where the greatest stories sleep like dragons waiting to wake, there lies a tale that scholars whisper about only in the deepest hours of night. It is the story of how reality itself cracked like an eggshell, how the very fabric of existence trembled and tore, and how ordinary souls became the threads that rewove the world back together again. This is the chronicle of the Oblivion Crisis, when the barriers between dimensions shattered like glass beneath a giant's fist, and mortals discovered that even gods can bleed. Picture, if you will, the Imperial city in the final golden days of the Third Era, when autumn leaves drifted down like ancient coins through courtyards that had known 1,000 years of peace. The white gold tower rose into morning mist like a finger pointing toward eternity, its stones humming with secrets that predated the memory of men. In those hallowed halls where emperors had ruled since time immemorial, few suspected that the very foundations of reality were beginning to crumble like parchment left too long in sunlight. Our tale begins with Marcus Valerius, a keeper of forbidden knowledge, whose gentle hands had turned more pages than most men count heartbeats. By candlelight and lampglow, he moved through the deepest vaults of the Imperial library, like a ghost among sleeping giants, his weathered fingers tracing words written in languages that had died before the first stones of civilization were laid. He was a scholar of the quiet sort, one who sought truth not for glory, but for the simple joy of understanding, unaware that destiny was weaving his name into a tapestry far grander than any mortal chronicle. On that fateful morning when our story truly begins, Marcus discovered something that made his blood run cold as winter rain. Hidden within a text so ancient, its pages seemed to whisper with their own voice, he found references to a prophecy that spoke of barriers wearing thin, of hungry darkness, pressing against the walls of the world, and of a time when the dragon's fire would die and leave all existence vulnerable to forces that dwelt in spaces between spaces. The words burned themselves into his memory, like brands of ice and fire. They spoke of gates that would open like wounds in the sky, of creatures that existed in geometries that mortal minds could barely comprehend, and of a choice that would determine whether reality itself would endure or crumble into the hungry void that waited beyond all knowing. But most terrifying of all was the final line, written in script, that seemed to shift and change even as he read it, promising that when the seals finally broke, even the gods themselves would. And so our story truly begins in those quiet days when the Empire rested in the gentle embrace of peace, unaware that ancient seals were beginning to weaken like old parchment, exposed to time and the patient hunger of forces that had waited since the world was young. The Third Era, in its 433rd year, was like a great tree in autumn, still mighty and proud, but with leaves beginning to turn colors that spoke of change and endings. Across the breadth of Tamriel, from the frozen peaks of Skyrim to the marshlands of Black Marsh, citizens of the Empire went about their daily lives with the comfortable certainty that came from generations of stability. Roads were safe, borders were secure, and the greatest worry of most folk was whether the harvest would be good enough to see them through the coming winter with full bellies and warm hearths. In the Imperial city, the heart of this vast realm, life flowed with the gentle rhythm of a river that has found its proper course. Merchants hawked their wares in the market district, while street musicians played melodies that had been old when the first emperor drew breath. Children played games of dragons and heroes in cobblestone squares, their laughter echoing off buildings that had stood since before their great-grandfathers were born. Temple bells marked the hours with bronze voices that seemed to carry blessings on every breeze, and the 9 divines watched over their people with the patient love of parents watching sleeping children. Marcus Valerius had spent 30 years of his life in service to knowledge, 30 years of quiet dedication in the depths of the Imperial library, where dust motes danced like tiny spirits in shafts of golden sunlight. His was a world of whispered pages and careful cataloging, of ancient texts that smelled of lavender and thyme, and of discoveries that came not with fanfare, but with the gentle satisfaction of puzzle pieces finding their proper places. His daily routine was as comforting as prayer and as regular as the movement of stars across the night sky. Each morning he would rise with the dawn and walk through the palace gardens where flowers bloomed in careful arrangements that spoke of centuries of cultivation. The gardeners would nod respectfully as he passed, these keepers of growing things recognizing a kindred spirit in this keeper of written wisdom. He would stop at the fountain where golden fish swam in lazy circles, watching the water catch the early light like liquid crystal, finding in its peaceful movement a meditation that prepared his mind for the day's work ahead. The Imperial Library was more than just a repository of books. It was a living temple to human knowledge, where every scroll and codex was a prayer to understanding. The main hall rose to heights that seemed to touch the very heavens, its walls lined with shelves that climbed toward shadows where the lamplight could not reach. Reading alcoves tucked away in corners provided intimate spaces for contemplation, each one equipped with a comfortable chair, a writing desk of polished wood, and a lamp that cast a warm circle of light perfect for study. Marcus had claimed one such alcove as his own domain 20 years past, and over time it had taken on the character of his gentle soul. Books were stacked with careful precision, their spines creating colorful borders around his workspace. A small brass teapot sat ready on a side table, along with a collection of ceramic cups that had seen countless hours of scholarly meditation. Dried herbs hung from small hooks, filling the air with scents of rosemary and sage that aided concentration and brought peace to troubled thoughts. But it was in the deepest vaults of the library that Marcus found his true calling, in chambers so far beneath the palace that few living souls had ever set foot within their hushed confines. Here lay the archives of ages past, documents written in hands that had long since returned to dust, chronicles of events so distant that they seemed more like myths than history. These texts were written in languages that predated the empire itself, in scripts that required not just knowledge but intuition to decipher, as if the ancient writers had encoded their wisdom in ways that only the truly dedicated could unlock. The vault where Marcus spent most of his time was circular, its walls carved from a single massive stone and lined with shelves that seemed to have grown from the rock itself. A single great lamp hung from the center of the ceiling, its light falling in a perfect circle that illuminated a reading table carved from white marble. The air here was different somehow, thick with the weight of accumulated knowledge and pregnant with secrets that had slept undisturbed for centuries beyond counting. It was here, in this sacred space dedicated to the preservation of wisdom, that Marcus first began to notice the signs that would herald the greatest crisis in recorded history. At first, they were small things, easy to dismiss as coincidence or imagination. Books would be found open to pages he was certain had been closed the night before. Texts would seem to rearrange themselves on the shelves, as if some invisible hand was guiding him toward specific volumes. Most unsettling of all, he began to hear whispers in languages he did not recognize, voices that seemed to speak from the very walls themselves, sharing secrets in tongues that had been silent since the world was young. The signs were gentle at first, like ripples on a still pond, but Marcus was a man who had dedicated his life to noticing patterns others might miss. In text after text, he began to find references to barriers wearing thin, to ancient seals weakening with the passage of time, and to forces that pressed against the foundations of reality, like water against a dam that had stood too long without repair. As the days passed like pages turning in an ancient tome, Marcus began to notice that the very air seemed to shimmer with unspoken possibilities, and across the empire, sensitive souls stirred uneasily in their sleep, touched by dreams that carried the scent of otherworldly fires and the whisper of voices speaking in geometries that had no names. The summer of 433 felt different somehow, charged with an energy that seemed to pulse just beneath the surface of ordinary reality. Merchants traveling the great roads between cities reported strange phenomena that their rational minds struggled to explain. Horses would shy away from certain stretches of perfectly safe highway, their eyes rolling white with terror at sights only they could see. Compass needles would spin wildly in areas where the magnetic field had remained stable for generations, as if something was interfering with the very forces that held the world in its proper orientation. In taverns across the empire, travelers shared stories that grew stranger with each telling. A merchant from Coral spoke of seeing towers that flickered in and out of existence on the horizon, their architecture too alien for mortal eyes to fully comprehend. A courier from Bruma described roads that seemed to stretch longer than they should, as if distance itself was becoming unreliable. Most unsettling of all were the reports from the Arcane University, where apprentice mages found their scrying spells showing glimpses of landscapes that violated every law of natural philosophy, realms where the sky burned with colors that had no place in the spectrum of earthly light. Citizens throughout Cyrodiil began experiencing dreams that shared disturbing similarities. Night after night, people found themselves walking through crimson landscapes where the very ground pulsed like living flesh, where towers of black glass pierced skies that bled like open wounds, and where creatures of impossible beauty and terrible purpose moved with the fluid grace of living nightmares. These dreams felt more real than waking life, leaving behind memories so vivid that dreamers could recall every detail with crystalline clarity, as if their sleeping minds had actually visited these alien realms. Marcus noticed these reports because he was a man who made it his business to notice patterns, and the pattern that was emerging made his scholarly blood run cold as mountain snow. In his private notebooks, he began collecting these accounts, mapping them like a cartographer charting unknown territories. What he discovered was that the dreams were not random but followed specific geographical lines that corresponded to ancient Aelid settlements, as if the wild elves had built their cities along pathways that connected this world to others beyond the veil of normal perception. The scholar found himself drawn deeper into archives that most of his colleagues considered too dangerous or too theoretical to merit serious study. These were texts that dealt with what ancient writers called the liminal barriers, the invisible walls that separated the realm of Mundus from the infinite chaos of Oblivion. According to these half-mythical sources, these barriers were not permanent fixtures of reality, but rather constructs maintained by conscious will and ancient compact, agreements made in the dawn times between gods and mortals to keep the forces of chaos safely contained in their proper spheres. What Marcus discovered in these forbidden texts made him understand that the empire itself was far more than a political entity. It was a mystical construct, a living seal that drew its power not from armies or gold, but from the unbroken succession of dragon-born emperors, whose very existence served as a key in a cosmic lock that held the doors between worlds firmly closed. The Amulet of Kings was not merely a symbol of imperial authority, but a physical anchor point where the will of Akatosh, the dragon god of time, maintained the structural integrity of reality itself. Night after night, Marcus worked by the light of his faithful lamp, copying passages from texts so ancient that their vellum was nearly transparent with age. He learned of the covenant of the First Empire, the mystical bargain that had been struck between Saint Alessia and the dragon god, trading mortal freedom for cosmic responsibility. He read accounts of previous attempts to breach the liminal barriers, each one thwarted by the vigilance of dragon-born rulers who understood that their throne came with obligations that extended far beyond the merely political. But most disturbing of all were the references to cults that actively sought to tear down these barriers, organizations of mortals who had made contact with Daedric princes and willingly served as agents of chaos within the ordered world. These groups appeared throughout history like a recurring infection, each generation spawning new adherents to the cause of cosmic dissolution. They went by many names across the centuries, but their goal remained constant: to open permanent gates between Mundus and Oblivion. allowing the Daedric princes to walk freely in the mortal realm and remake reality according to their alien desires. The most recent and most dangerous of these cults was mentioned only in the most guarded whispers among the ancient texts. They called themselves the Mythic Dawn, and according to the scattered references Marcus could find, they possessed knowledge that had been lost since the Merethic era, secrets of ritual and summoning that could actually accomplish what previous groups had only dreamed of attempting. Their leader was described as a mortal who had transcended the limitations of his birth through communion with Mehrunes Dagon, the Daedric Prince of Destruction and Change, becoming something neither fully human nor completely Daedric, but rather a bridge between realms that should never have been connected. Marcus spent long evenings walking the palace gardens after his research, trying to process the implications of what he was learning. The empire that had seemed so solid and eternal was revealed to be as fragile as a soap bubble, held together by forces that could fail if the right pressure was applied in the right place at the right time. The very stones beneath his feet were sustained by mystical energies that depended on the continued existence of an unbroken imperial bloodline, and if that line should ever be severed, the consequences would extend far beyond mere political chaos. The summer nights grew longer and stranger as Marcus delved deeper into his research. He began to notice that the stars themselves seemed different. Their familiar patterns shifted slightly, as if the heavens were slowly rotating around an axis that existed in dimensions beyond the three that mortal minds could easily comprehend. Aurora appeared in southern skies where they had no business being, painting the darkness with sheets of green and gold that pulsed in rhythm with something vast and alien. Animals throughout the city began displaying behavior that their keepers found increasingly difficult to explain. The palace cats gathered in unusual numbers around the throne room, sitting in perfect circles that seemed to serve some purpose beyond ordinary feline logic. Dogs would howl at empty air, their voices raised in harmonies that sounded almost like primitive songs of warning. Even the goldfish in the palace fountains swam in patterns that suggested they were responding to currents that existed in more than just water. But perhaps most unsettling of all was the change Marcus began to notice in the dragonfires themselves. For over 400 years, these mystical flames had burned with perfect consistency in the temple at the heart of the Imperial city, their light serving as both symbol and reality of the Empire's spiritual health. Now, however, the flames seemed somehow diminished, flickering with an uncertainty that made even the most casual observers pause and wonder. The temple priests maintained that nothing was wrong, but Marcus could see the worry in their eyes, the way they tended the sacred fire with movements that spoke of barely controlled anxiety. As summer deepened toward autumn, and the first hints of changing seasons touched the air with promises of transformation, Marcus felt the weight of knowledge settling on his shoulders like a cloak woven from responsibility and fear. He had uncovered enough to understand that something momentous was approaching, something that would test every assumption about the nature of reality itself. But the most terrifying aspect of his discoveries was not what he had learned, but what remained hidden, the final pieces of the puzzle that would reveal just how close the Empire stood to the edge of an abyss that had no bottom and no end. The ancient texts spoke in whispers of those who sought to tear the veil between worlds, their words flowing like a gentle stream of dark knowledge that Marcus followed with growing unease, each revelation leading him deeper into mysteries that scholars had died rather than fully comprehend. Secrets that had been buried beneath centuries of careful silence for reasons that were becoming terrifyingly clear. In the deepest vaults of the Imperial Library, hidden behind wards that had been woven by archmages whose names were lost to history, Marcus discovered documents that made his hands tremble as he turned their pages. These were not the carefully sanitized accounts found in the public archives, but raw testimonies written by survivors of encounters with forces that should not exist. Confessions extracted from cultists who had glimpsed the true nature of reality and found it wanting. and reports compiled by agents of the Blades who had investigated disappearances that followed patterns too disturbing to be coincidental. The Mythic Dawn emerged from these shadowed pages like a cancer growing in the heart of the Empire, their influence spreading through networks that connected seemingly unrelated individuals across all levels of society. They were not the crude demon worshippers that most people imagined when they thought of Daedric cults, but rather sophisticated philosophers who had convinced themselves that the ordered structure of reality was a prison that confined the infinite potential of existence within arbitrary boundaries that served only to limit the growth of consciousness toward its ultimate destiny. Their foundational text was a work known as the Mysterium Xerxes, a tome that supposedly contained the direct words of Mehrunes Dagon himself, dictated to mortal scribes who had achieved a level of communion with the Prince of Destruction that allowed them to survive the experience of transcribing divine madness into human language. According to the fragments Marcus could find in captured correspondence, this book revealed techniques for expanding consciousness beyond the limitations of linear thought, for perceiving dimensions that existed parallel to the familiar three, and for establishing communication with entities whose existence predated the formation of the current cosmic order. The leader of this organization was described in terms that suggested he had progressed far beyond ordinary humanity through his studies of the forbidden arts. Nankar Cameron was portrayed not as a simple cultist but as a scholar whose dedication to understanding had carried him into realms of knowledge that transformed the very essence of his being. Those who had encountered him and lived to tell the tale spoke of eyes that reflected landscapes no mortal had ever seen, of words that carried meanings beyond their literal interpretation, and of a presence that seemed to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions, as if he had learned to distribute his consciousness across realities like a spider whose web spanned worlds. Marcus found testimony from a former member of the cult who had managed to escape before the final initiation ceremonies that would have bound his soul irrevocably to the service of destruction. This anonymous account described gatherings held in hidden chambers where the very air seemed thick with possibility, where initiates learned to perceive the boundaries between dimensions as suggestions rather than absolute barriers, and where advanced practitioners demonstrated abilities that violated every known law of magical theory. According to this witness, the Mythic Dawn did not seek destruction for its own sake, but rather viewed the current structure of reality as a temporary phase in the evolution of existence towards something far grander and more complex. They believed that the barriers between Mundus and Oblivion were artificial constructs that prevented consciousness from achieving its true potential, that the ordered stability of the Empire represented a stagnation that held all sentient beings in a state of spiritual infancy, and that only through the controlled dissolution of these limitations could mortals hope to transcend their current existence and join the ranks of truly divine beings. The cult's ultimate goal was nothing less than the complete restructuring of reality, according to principles that would eliminate the distinction between creator and created, between order and chaos, between the possible and the impossible. They envisioned a universe where every conscious being possessed the power to reshape existence according to their will, where the limitations of physical law had been transcended through the integration of Oblivion's infinite potential into the structured framework of Mundus, creating a synthesis that would represent the next stage in cosmic evolution. But achieving this transformation required more than philosophical understanding or ritual practice. It demanded the complete destruction of the current cosmic order, beginning with the elimination of the dragonfires that served as the primary mystical barrier, preventing Daedric princes from manifesting directly in the mortal realm. The cult had spent generations infiltrating every level of Imperial society, placing members in positions where they could influence events toward their desired conclusion, waiting patiently for the moment when all their preparations would culminate in the ultimate act of cosmic liberation. Marcus discovered correspondence that revealed the scope of their infiltration with chilling clarity. Members of the Mythic Dawn had secured positions within the Legion, the bureaucracy, the merchant guilds, and even the temples dedicated to the 9 divines. They communicated through codes hidden in seemingly innocent commercial transactions, coordinated their activities through networks that spanned the entire continent, and maintained cells of dedicated operatives in every major city of the empire, all working toward the single goal of creating the conditions necessary for their master plan to succeed. The scholar spent sleepless nights studying maps that showed the locations of known Mythic Dawn activities, trying to discern the pattern underlying their seemingly random distribution. What he discovered was that these sites corresponded precisely to points where the barriers between dimensions were naturally thinner, places where ancient Allied Wayshrine networks had once channeled magical energies along pathways that connected distant locations through spaces that existed between normal geometry. The cult was positioning itself to take advantage of these natural weaknesses in reality's structure, using knowledge preserved from the wild elves to identify points where relatively small applications of precisely focused energy could create cascading failures in the entire system of liminal barriers. But the most disturbing discovery came when Marcus found references to a specific date that appeared repeatedly in captured Mythic Dawn communications, a convergence of astronomical and mystical factors that would create optimal conditions for their great working. The date was rapidly approaching, falling within the final weeks of summer when certain celestial alignments would weaken the boundaries between worlds, just enough to allow their carefully prepared rituals to achieve permanent rather than temporary effects. The plan they had developed over centuries of patient preparation was elegantly simple in its basic structure, but terrifyingly complex in its execution. First, they would eliminate the current emperor and all potential heirs to the throne, severing the mystical connection between the dragon fires and the divine will of Akatosh that sustained them. Then, in the confusion that would follow the collapse of the Imperial government, they would perform a great summoning that would tear open permanent gates between Mundus and Oblivion at dozens of prepared locations simultaneously, creating a network of interdimensional portals that would allow Mehrunes Dagon himself to enter the mortal realm with his full power intact. Once the Prince of Destruction had established a physical presence in Mundus, he would begin the process of remaking reality according to the vision revealed in the Mysterium Xerxes, dissolving the artificial boundaries that separated different planes of existence and allowing consciousness to expand beyond its current limitations. The transformation would be traumatic for those unprepared to embrace the new paradigm, but the cult believed that those who survived the initial phase would discover capabilities they had never imagined possible, becoming gods in their own right, within a universe where every thought possessed the power to reshape existence. Marcus closed the final document he had been studying and sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of knowledge pressing down upon him, like a physical burden that threatened to crush his spirit beneath its terrible implications. Everything he had discovered pointed to the same inescapable conclusion. The Mythic Dawn was not a collection of deluded fanatics, but a sophisticated organization that possessed both the knowledge and the resources necessary to accomplish exactly what they claimed they would do. The Empire stood on the very edge of an abyss so deep that its bottom could not be seen, and the forces gathering to push it over that edge were already in motion, guided by minds that had spent lifetimes preparing for this moment of ultimate transformation. The scholar understood that he now possessed information that could change the course of history if it reached the right hands, but he also knew that the very people who most needed to hear these warnings were the ones least likely to believe them, until the moment when belief became irrelevant and only action remained as the final barrier between civilization and the infinite hunger of chaos that pressed against the walls of the world like floodwaters testing a dam that had stood too long without repair. The path ahead stretched like a ribbon of moonlight, leading Marcus toward answers that waited patiently in the distance. But it was in the highest towers of the White Gold Palace that the true weight of approaching destiny could be felt most keenly, where Emperor Uriel Septim VII moved through his final days with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen the shape of fate in dreams that came with the authority of divine revelation. The aging emperor possessed a quality of peaceful resignation that seemed to emanate from his very presence, like warmth from a dying fire, a serenity born not from ignorance of what was coming, but from complete acceptance of his role in events that had been set in motion long before his birth. For decades, his sleep had been haunted by visions that grew clearer with each passing year, dreams that showed him walking through corridors of black glass, while voices spoke prophecies in languages that predated human speech, revelations that came with the terrible clarity of absolute truth. In the early morning hours, when the palace lay wrapped in the gentle embrace of dawn, Uriel would stand at the great window of his private study and watch the sun rise over the Imperial city like a golden promise of another day's grace. His weathered hands would rest upon the stone sill while his mind processed the fragments of prophetic dreams that clung to consciousness like morning mist. Visions of gates opening like wounds in the fabric of reality, and heroes rising from the most unlikely places to face challenges that would test the very foundations of existence. The emperor's daily routine had taken on the quality of ritual in these final weeks, each action performed with the careful precision of a man who understood that every moment might be his last opportunity to fulfill obligations that stretched back through generations of imperial responsibility. He would meet with his counselors in the circular chamber where maps of the empire covered tables carved from single blocks of marble, listening to reports of strange phenomena with the patient attention of someone who already knew what they would contain, but needed to hear them spoken aloud to transform private knowledge into public awareness. Marcus occasionally glimpsed the emperor during his research in the palace archives, noting how Uriel Septim seemed to carry himself like a man preparing for a journey to places from which travelers rarely returned. There was no fear in the imperial presence, only the calm acceptance of one who had spent a lifetime learning to read the signs that others dismissed as coincidence or imagination. When their eyes met across the corridors of learning, the scholar felt the weight of imperial attention like a gentle pressure that seemed to acknowledge his work without need for words. The blades, who served as the emperor's personal guard, had noticed changes in their sovereign that they discussed only in whispers among themselves, speaking of how he would sometimes pause in the middle of conversations, as if listening to voices that only he could hear, or how he would issue orders that seemed to prepare for contingencies that had no basis in current circumstances, yet proved prescient with disturbing frequency. Captain Renault reported that the emperor had begun requesting maps of regions that had been peaceful for centuries, studying layouts of ancient fortifications, as if anticipating conflicts that existed only in the realm of possibility. But it was in his private moments that Uriel Septim revealed the true depth of his prophetic burden. When he would sit alone in his study surrounded by texts that dealt with the mystical aspects of imperial succession, reading passages about the dragonfires with the intensity of a man trying to memorize instructions for a task he would only have one opportunity to perform correctly. The amulet of kings rested heavy against his chest during these sessions, its weight seeming to increase with each passing day, as if the artifact itself was absorbing power in preparation for trials that would test its capacity to maintain the barriers between worlds. The emperor's correspondence during this period revealed a mind grappling with knowledge that could not be shared directly, but had to be communicated through careful suggestions and oblique references. His letters to provincial governors contained subtle requests for information about unusual activities in remote areas, inquiries that seemed random to their recipients, but formed a pattern that would have been recognizable to anyone who understood the true nature of the threats gathering in the shadows of the empire. In the palace gardens where ancient statues watched over beds of flowers that had bloomed for centuries, Uriel would take evening walks that had become meditations on the nature of sacrifice and responsibility. The gardeners who tended these spaces with devotion that bordered on worship noticed that the emperor's roots had begun following patterns that corresponded to the sacred geometry underlying the palace's construction, as if he was tracing mystical pathways that connected the seat of earthly power to forces that operated on cosmic scales. Martin Septim, the emperor's unacknowledged son, who served as a priest in the chapel of Akatosh in Kvatch, received letters during this period that seemed like simple expressions of paternal interest in his scholarly pursuits, but contained encoded references to texts that dealt with the deepest mysteries of dragonborn inheritance. The young priest, dedicated to his studies of divine philosophy and unaware of his true heritage, treasured these communications from a patron he believed to be simply a well-educated noble with interests that aligned with his own theological research. The emperor's dreams during these final weeks took on qualities that transcended the normal boundaries between sleeping and waking consciousness, visions so vivid and detailed that he would sometimes find himself uncertain whether conversations with long-dead predecessors had actually occurred, or were products of a mind processing information that existed beyond the limitations of linear time. These nocturnal journeys carried him through landscapes of possibility where he could see the consequences of different choices spreading out like branches of an infinite tree, each decision point creating new realities that coexisted in dimensions that mortal perception could only glimpse in moments of transcendent clarity. Chancellor Rakato noticed that the emperor's public appearances had taken on an almost ceremonial quality, as if each formal occasion was being conducted with awareness that it might be the last opportunity to fulfill certain ritual obligations that maintained the mystical balance upon which the empire's stability depended. The aging ruler would speak to assembled nobles and officials with words that carried meanings beyond their surface content, references to duties that transcended political considerations and touched upon responsibilities that extended into realms where individual choice could determine the fate of entire dimensions. The palace staff reported strange occurrences during these final days that they attributed to the approach of some significant but undefined change. Candles would burn with flames that cast shadows in directions that defied the laws of physics. Mirrors would reflect images that included details not present in the rooms they supposedly showed, and corridors would sometimes seem longer or shorter than their actual measurements suggested, as if the very architecture of the palace was responding to forces that operated according to principles beyond normal understanding. Uriel Septim's final audiences with foreign ambassadors and provincial representatives were conducted with a formality that emphasized the continuity of imperial tradition while containing subtle instructions for maintaining stability during periods of transition and uncertainty. These carefully worded conversations provided guidance for dealing with situations that had not yet occurred but were anticipated with the certainty that came from prophetic knowledge, advice that would prove invaluable when conventional wisdom failed to address circumstances that fell outside the normal range of political experience. The emperor's personal effects during this period included artifacts that had been removed from the deepest vaults of imperial storage, items that had not seen daylight for generations, but were now arranged in his private chambers, as if preparing for some ritual that would require access to tools that existed at the intersection between the material and spiritual realms. Ancient ceremonial weapons rested alongside books written in scripts that predated the empire, while crystals that pulsed with their own inner light provided illumination that seemed to come from sources beyond the merely physical. As the final day approached with the inevitability of sunrise, Uriel Septim VII prepared to fulfill the role that had been assigned to him by forces that operated on scales too vast for mortal comprehension, accepting with quiet courage the knowledge that his death would serve purposes that extended far beyond the merely personal. The dragon blood that flowed in his veins carried not just the authority to rule but the responsibility to serve as a willing sacrifice when the mystical balance that protected reality itself required the ultimate expression of imperial duty, a choice that would echo through dimensions where heroes are born and legends take shape in the crucible of absolute necessity. The deepest archives held secrets that whispered like autumn wind through ancient halls, speaking of barriers that held not just enemies at bay, but reality itself in its proper shape, revelations that transformed Marcus's understanding of existence from a simple matter of physical law into something far more complex and terrifying. A cosmic dance balanced on the edge of possibilities that could unmake everything he had ever believed to be permanent and unchanging. In texts so old, their vellum was nearly transparent with age, written in inks that seemed to glow with their own inner light when viewed under the proper conditions. Marcus discovered truths that made him pause in wonder at the sheer audacity of the cosmic arrangement that had sustained the Empire for over 4 centuries. The dragonfires were not merely ceremonial flames maintained by tradition and religious devotion, but rather physical manifestations of a metaphysical engine that drew its power from the very fabric of time itself, channeled through the willing sacrifice of dragonborn souls who served as living conduits between the divine realm of Aetherius and the structured reality of Mundus. The Amulet of Kings, that ancient artifact that had adorned the throats of emperors since the days of Saint Alessia, was revealed in these forbidden texts to be far more than a symbol of political authority or even religious significance. It was described as a cosmic key, a device created through the collaboration of gods and mortals that could unlock or seal passages between dimensions with precision that made conventional magic seem like the crude scratchings of children learning to write their first letters. The red gem at its center was not merely a precious stone, but a crystallized fragment of Akatosh's own essence, a piece of the dragon god's eternal being that had been willingly separated from the divine whole and embedded in matter that could exist simultaneously in multiple planes of reality. Marcus read with growing amazement accounts of the original covenant between Alessia and the dragon god. A bargain struck in the dawn times when the boundaries between gods and mortals were far more permeable than they had since become. The rebel slave queen had offered more than just her own life in service to Akatosh. She had pledged the eternal devotion of her bloodline to serve as wardens of reality itself, guardians whose very existence would anchor the barriers between worlds in a configuration that would prevent the forces of chaos from overwhelming the structured universe that had been so carefully crafted by the original spirits who shaped creation from the infinite possibility of the void. The dragon blood that flowed in the veins of legitimate emperors was not simply a genetic heritage, but a mystical substance that existed partially outside normal space and time, connecting each dragonborn ruler to all others who had come before and would come after in a chain of consciousness that transcended individual mortality. When an emperor died, his essence did not simply pass into whatever afterlife awaited mortal souls, but instead merged with this eternal continuity, adding his accumulated wisdom and experience to a collective awareness that guided and protected the empire through challenges that required perspectives spanning multiple lifetimes. According to these ancient sources, the coronation ceremony that installed each new emperor was far more than a political ritual or religious observance. It was described as a controlled form of divine possession in which the candidate's individual identity was temporarily subsumed into the greater consciousness of the dragon god, allowing Akatosh to evaluate their worthiness to serve as a living anchor point for the cosmic forces that maintained reality's structural integrity. Those who proved inadequate to bear this responsibility would die during the ceremony itself, their souls consumed by energies too powerful for insufficient vessels to contain, while those who survived emerged transformed into something that was simultaneously more and less than human. The text spoke of abilities that came with this transformation, powers that extended far beyond the Thuum or dragon shouts that were the most visible manifestation of dragonborn heritage. Legitimate emperors could perceive events occurring in distant locations as if they were present, sense threats to the empire's mystical balance before they manifested in the physical realm, and communicate directly with the divine forces that had shaped the cosmos during the earliest epochs of creation. More importantly, for the maintenance of the liminal barriers, they could channel their life force directly into the mystical constructs that kept the doors between worlds sealed against intrusion by entities whose very presence would corrupt the ordered structure of reality. Marcus discovered detailed descriptions of the chamber beneath the Temple of the One, where the dragon fires burned with flames that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, fed not by conventional fuel but by the continuous sacrifice of Imperial will channeled through the Amulet of Kings. The architectural plans showed a space designed according to principles that incorporated elements from Allied, Nordic, and Cyrodiilic mystical traditions, creating a synthesis that focused cosmic energies with precision that would have been impossible using any single magical system. The walls were inscribed with formulae that described the mathematical relationships governing the interaction between different planes of existence, equations so complex that understanding them required not just intellectual knowledge but spiritual enlightenment that came only through direct communion with forces that operated beyond the boundaries of rational thought. The scholar learned that the dragon fires served multiple functions within the cosmic arrangement that protected Mundus from invasion by Daedric forces. On the most basic level, they created a resonance field that made it extremely difficult for entities native to Oblivion to maintain coherent form within the boundaries of structured reality, essentially functioning as a massive ward that covered the entire planet. More subtly, they served as anchor points that maintained the separation between different planes of existence, preventing the kind of dimensional overlap that would allow Daedric princes to manifest their full power within the mortal realm. But perhaps most importantly, the dragon fires functioned as a communication system that allowed the gods themselves to monitor events in Mundus and intervene when necessary to prevent violations of the cosmic laws that had been established during the convention that ended the Dawn era. When the flames burned properly, fed by the willing sacrifice of a legitimate dragon-born emperor, they created a direct channel between the earthly realm and Aetherius that enabled divine guidance to reach mortal minds without the distortion that normally accompanied attempts at cross-dimensional communication. The ancient texts contained warnings about what would happen if this system ever failed. Descriptions written with the careful precision of scholars who had studied the theoretical implications of cosmic disaster with the same methodical approach they might apply to any other academic subject. Without the mystical barriers maintained by the dragon fires, the boundaries between Mundus and Oblivion would begin to deteriorate like walls exposed to acid rain, creating weak points where determined efforts by Daedric cults could tear open permanent gates between dimensions. These portals would grow larger and more stable over time, eventually allowing entire armies of Daedric creatures to pour into the mortal realm with the goal of reshaping reality according to principles that would transform Mundus into an extension of their chaotic home dimension. The process of dimensional collapse was described in terms that made Marcus understand why these texts had been hidden away in the deepest vaults where only the most trusted scholars could access them. The integration of Oblivion's chaotic energies into Mundus would not simply change the physical appearance of the world, but would alter the fundamental laws that governed existence itself, making it impossible for mortal minds to maintain coherent consciousness without being transformed into something that bore no resemblance to their original nature. Cities would become living entities that devoured their inhabitants, time would flow in multiple directions simultaneously, and the distinction between thought and reality would dissolve until every idle fantasy became manifest with consequences that could reshape entire continents. But the most terrifying aspect of these revelations was the discovery that the system which had protected the empire for so many centuries was not designed to be permanent. The constant drain of maintaining the liminal barriers placed enormous stress on each successive emperor, gradually weakening the connection between the mortal realm and the divine forces that sustained it. According to calculations preserved in mathematical texts that required advanced knowledge of metaphysical engineering to understand, the mystical infrastructure that supported the empire's spiritual defenses had been designed to last approximately 4.5 centuries before requiring either complete renovation or catastrophic failure. Marcus performed the arithmetic with hands that trembled as he realized the implications of what he was discovering. The empire was now in its 433rd year, placing it within mere months of the theoretical limit of the current system's operational capacity. Unless some method could be found to either renew the original covenant with Akatosh or establish an entirely new arrangement for maintaining the barriers between worlds, the dragonfires would soon fail regardless of whether external forces sought to extinguish them, bringing about the very crisis that the Mythic Dawn was working so desperately to precipitate through their own efforts. The scholar sat back in his chair and stared at the calculations spread across his desk, understanding finally that the approaching catastrophe was not simply the result of cult activity or political instability, but the inevitable consequence of a cosmic arrangement that had always been intended as a temporary measure, a breathing space that would allow mortal civilization to develop the strength and wisdom necessary to face challenges that required resources beyond those available to any single generation, no matter how heroic or dedicated they might prove to be in the ultimate test of their resolve and character. Like a tree sensing the approaching storm through vibrations that traveled deeper than roots could reach, Marcus felt compelled to gather and preserve the knowledge that might soon be scattered like leaves on the wind, understanding with the clarity that comes only in moments of absolute crisis that his role had transformed from passive observer to active guardian of wisdom that could determine whether civilization would survive the trials that were rushing toward them, with the inevitability of an avalanche. The white gold tower seemed to hold its breath during those final days of summer, as if the ancient stones themselves could sense the approaching transformation that would test every assumption about the nature of reality and the permanence of institutions that had seemed as eternal as the mountains themselves. Servants moved more quietly through the corridors, their footsteps muffled by an awareness they could not articulate, speaking in whispers even when discussing the most mundane aspects of their daily routines, as if loud voices might somehow disturb the delicate balance that kept the world from tilting into chaos. Marcus found himself working with an urgency that bordered on desperation, spending 18 hours each day in the archives, copying passages from texts that might be lost if the palace fell to whatever forces were gathering in the shadows, beyond the reach of conventional intelligence. His lamp burned through the night hours while he transcribed formulae for maintaining mystical barriers, recorded the true names of Daedric princes that could be used to bind or banish them, and preserved maps showing the locations of ancient Eyelide wayshrine networks that might serve as either weakness or strength, depending on who controlled access to their power. The scholar had begun creating multiple copies of the most critical information, hiding them in locations throughout the Imperial city where they might survive even if the palace itself was destroyed. One set of documents was sealed within waterproof containers and hidden in the depths of the old Eyelide ruins beneath the city. Another was entrusted to a contact among the priests at the Temple of the One, with instructions for its preservation, regardless of what befell the Empire. And a third was prepared for transport to the Arcane University, where it could be integrated into their existing archives without drawing unwanted attention from those who might seek to suppress such dangerous knowledge. The blades had become more visible in the palace corridors. Their presence felt rather than seen as they moved through shadows with the fluid grace of warriors who had spent lifetimes learning to become invisible when visibility might mean death. Captain Reno could be glimpsed in brief conversations with other members of the Emperor's Guard, their words too quiet to overhear, but their body language speaking of preparations for conflicts that would require skills beyond those needed for ordinary palace security. The armory reported increased requests for weapons that had not been removed from storage for decades, ancient blades forged with techniques that had been passed down through generations of Imperial smiths, who understood that some threats required tools crafted according to principles that merged metallurgy with metaphysics. Marcus noticed that the palace cats had begun gathering in unprecedented numbers around certain locations that corresponded to points where the building's mystical architecture focused cosmic energies for purposes that remained hidden, even from most of the scholars who studied within these walls. The animals would sit in perfect silence for hours, their eyes fixed on spaces that appeared empty to human perception, but clearly contained phenomena that feline senses could detect with accuracy that suggested they were responding to more than simple environmental changes. Even the goldfish in the ornamental fountains swam in patterns that seemed to trace geometric forms too complex to be coincidental, as if every living thing within the palace was being influenced by forces that operated beyond the normal boundaries of cause and effect. The emperor's daily routine had taken on aspects of ritual that went far beyond the ceremonial requirements of imperial protocol, each action performed with precision that suggested awareness of symbolic meanings that transformed mundane activities into components of a vast working designed to maintain stability in circumstances where conventional methods of governance would prove inadequate. His meetings with counselors now included discussions of contingency plans that seemed to anticipate scenarios too improbable to merit serious consideration. Yet the careful attention given to these theoretical possibilities suggested that those in positions of ultimate responsibility possessed information that was not being shared with subordinates who lacked the clearance or the psychological preparation necessary to process implications that extended beyond the merely political. During one of his evening walks through the palace gardens, Marcus encountered Chancellor Okato engaged in conversation with several figures whose robes identified them as members of the Elder Council, but whose faces were concealed by hoods that prevented identification. Their discussion ceased abruptly when they noticed his presence, but not before he caught fragments of conversation that mentioned locations throughout the empire where strange phenomena had been reported, references to ancient treaties with organizations that officially did not exist, and coded phrases that seemed to relate to plans for maintaining governmental continuity under circumstances that would challenge the very foundations of imperial authority. The scholar's research had led him to understand that the approaching crisis would not be limited to mystical or military dimensions, but would encompass challenges that would test every aspect of the civilization that had grown up around the empire's protective influence. The economic systems that depended on safe trade routes, the legal frameworks that assumed the continued existence of central authority, the cultural traditions that had evolved during centuries of relative stability, all would face disruption that could prove as devastating as any physical invasion if preparations were not made to preserve essential functions during periods of chaos and uncertainty. Marcus began preparing documents that would serve as guides for maintaining critical services if normal governmental structures collapsed, instructions for preserving agricultural knowledge that could prevent famine during extended periods of conflict, and procedures for establishing communication networks that could function without reliance on imperial infrastructure that might be compromised or destroyed. These preparations felt like constructing lifeboats for passengers on a ship that had not yet begun to sink, but the scholar's understanding of historical patterns suggested that civilizations faced their greatest danger not during the initial crisis, but in the aftermath, when the absence of familiar structures created opportunities for elements that thrived in conditions of social breakdown. The mysterious visitors to the palace during this period included individuals whose presence was noted but whose identities remained concealed, through methods that suggested either high-level political connections or access to magical techniques that could render them effectively invisible to conventional surveillance. The Blades reported encounters with figures who seemed to possess detailed knowledge of palace security procedures, who moved through restricted areas without triggering alarms that should have responded to unauthorized presence, and who left behind traces that indicated familiarity with routes that were known only to personnel who had worked within these walls for decades. These incidents created an atmosphere of tension that affected everyone who lived or worked within the palace complex, a sense that events were building toward some climactic confrontation that would determine not just the fate of individuals, but the direction of history itself. Conversations took on undertones of farewell, as if participants were aware that the relationships and routines that had defined their lives might soon be disrupted beyond recognition, transformed by forces that would reshape every aspect of existence according to principles that bore no resemblance to the familiar patterns that had provided stability and meaning for so many generations. Marcus found himself thinking increasingly about legacy, about the responsibility that came with possessing knowledge that might prove crucial for those who would inherit the consequences of decisions being made in shadowed chambers by people whose names might never be recorded in the official histories that future scholars would study in attempts to understand how the world had been transformed during these pivotal moments. The texts he was preserving represented more than just academic curiosities or historical artifacts. They were tools that could be used to rebuild civilization if the existing structures proved inadequate to survive the trials that were approaching with accelerating velocity. The scholar's dreams during this period took on qualities that suggested his mind was processing information that extended beyond the boundaries of normal sensory experience. Visions that seemed to show possible futures spreading out like branches of an infinite tree, each decision point creating new realities that coexisted in dimensions accessible only to consciousness that had learned to transcend the limitations of linear time. These nocturnal journeys carried him through landscapes where familiar landmarks had been transformed by forces that operated according to alien geometries, where the sky burned with colors that had no names in any mortal language, and where heroes whose faces he could not quite remember fought battles whose outcomes would determine whether hope or despair would shape the dawn of whatever age was about to begin. As the final hours of the old world ticked away with the relentless precision of clockwork mechanisms that had been wound by hands belonging to powers that operated on cosmic scales, Marcus completed his preparations with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had done everything within his capacity to preserve what could be preserved and prepare what could be prepared, understanding that the ultimate test of his efforts would come not in the peaceful sanctuary of scholarly research, but in the crucible of events that would require ordinary mortals to discover reserves of courage and wisdom they had never imagined they possessed. When the ancient seals finally broke, it was not with thunder, but with a silence so profound that even the stones of the Imperial city seemed to gasp in wonder, as if the universe itself paused to acknowledge that the fundamental laws governing the relationship between order and chaos were about to be rewritten by forces whose power had been constrained for so long that their liberation would reshape reality according to principles that mortal minds could barely comprehend without being transformed in the process. The moment of breaking came in the deep hours before dawn, when the boundary between night and day grows thin and possibilities that are normally held in check by the weight of accumulated certainty find cracks through which they can slip into the realm of actual occurrence. Marcus felt it first as a change in the quality of silence that surrounded his lamp-lit study, a shift so subtle that he might have dismissed it as imagination if not for the way his carefully arranged documents began to flutter, despite the complete absence of any breeze that could account for their movement through the still air of the windowless archive. The dragon fires, which had burned with perfect consistency for over 4 centuries, flickered once and then guttered to darkness with a finality that sent shockwaves through the mystical infrastructure of the entire empire. creating resonance effects that would propagate outward at the speed of thought to every corner of Tamriel, where sensitive souls would wake from sleep with the absolute certainty that something fundamental had changed forever. The temple priests who had tended these sacred flames with devotion spanning generations fell to their knees in prayer, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing not just the end of a ritual tradition, but the collapse of cosmic barriers that had protected their world from forces whose very existence posed threats to the continued viability of structured reality. Marcus rushed to his window and looked out over the Imperial city, just as the first Oblivion Gate began to manifest in the distance, its initial appearance creating ripples in the fabric of space that made the air itself seem to shimmer like water disturbed by stones thrown into still pools. The phenomenon started as nothing more than a distortion that might have been dismissed as heat haze, if not for the way it seemed to fold in upon itself with geometric precision that suggested intelligence behind its formation, consciousness directing energies, according to mathematical principles that incorporated dimensions beyond the familiar three that defined the boundaries of mortal perception. The portal grew with surprising gentleness, expanding not through violent rupture, but through a process that resembled the blooming of some impossible flower, whose petals were composed of crystallized possibility rather than ordinary matter. The edges of the gate shimmered with frequencies of light that existed in spectrums invisible to normal human vision, creating aurora effects that painted the dawn sky with colors that had no equivalence in terrestrial experience. Hues that seemed to bypass optical nerves entirely and register as sensations that combined aspects of sight, sound, and something that could only be described as emotional resonance with forces that operated beyond conventional categories of perception. Citizens emerged from their homes to witness this unprecedented spectacle, gathering in the streets not with panic, but with the quiet awe of people confronting phenomena that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality itself. Their faces turned skyward with expressions that combined wonder and terror in proportions that shifted moment by moment as their minds struggled to process experiences for which their previous existence had provided no adequate preparation. Children pointed with the fearless curiosity that comes naturally to those who have not yet learned that some things should be feared, while their parents drew them closer with protective instincts that responded to threats operating on levels too fundamental to be analyzed through rational thought. The first Daedra to emerge from the gate moved with an alien grace that seemed to incorporate principles of motion that existed independently of the physical laws governing movement within Mundus, their forms shifting between configurations that suggested different approaches to the problem of maintaining coherent identity while existing simultaneously in multiple dimensions. These beings were not the crude demons of popular imagination, but rather entities whose beauty was as terrible as their strangeness, creatures whose very presence caused reality to bend around them like space warping in the vicinity of massive gravitational fields, creating distortion effects that made it difficult for mortal eyes to focus on their true forms for extended periods. Marcus watched through his window as more gates began opening throughout the city, each one appearing at locations that corresponded precisely to points where the ancient Eyelide Wayshrine network had once channeled magical energies between distant locations through pathways that existed in spaces between normal geometry. The pattern of their manifestation revealed the careful planning that had gone into this assault on reality, decades of preparation by minds that understood the underlying structure of the cosmic barriers well enough to target their weakest points with precision that maximized the effectiveness of each breach in the dimensional walls. The Legion responded with admirable speed, considering that they were facing a type of threat for which no training manual could have prepared them. But their conventional weapons proved inadequate against enemies whose relationship to physical existence was fundamentally different from anything they had encountered in previous conflicts. Swords passed through Daedric forms without creating wounds, arrows flew through targets that seemed solid, but proved to be composed of substances that existed partially in dimensions where normal matter could find no purchase, and defensive formations designed for battles against mortal opponents became liabilities when confronted with entities that could move through space according to principles that incorporated concepts of distance and barrier as suggestions rather than absolute limitations. The imperial palace itself became a fortress besieged not by armies that could be countered and strategies that could be analyzed, but by forces that operated according to alien logics that transformed familiar defensive advantages into weaknesses that could be exploited by enemies whose understanding of siege warfare incorporated techniques developed during conflicts that had raged across multiple dimensions for periods that predated the formation of linear time. The ancient wards that protected the seat of imperial power held against the initial assault, but Marcus could see stress fractures beginning to appear in the mystical barriers as they strained to contain energies that pressed against them with increasing force as more gates opened and the concentration of Oblivion's influence within Mundus reached levels that began to alter the fundamental properties of space itself. From his position in the tower, the scholar could observe the broader pattern of the assault as it unfolded across the imperial city with choreographed precision that revealed the scope of planning that had made this coordinated attack possible. Each gate had been positioned to maximize the disruption of critical infrastructure, while creating overlapping fields of interdimensional distortion that would prevent effective military response by transforming familiar terrain into alien landscapes, where conventional tactical doctrine became not just useless, but actively counterproductive. The citizens of the imperial city displayed remarkable resilience in the face of this unprecedented crisis, organizing themselves into groups that could provide mutual protection while avoiding the large-scale mobilization that would have made them vulnerable to enemies whose preferred tactics involved exploiting the predictable responses of minds that thought in terms of conventional conflict. Merchants used their knowledge of the city's commercial networks to establish supply lines that could function despite the disruption of normal transportation routes, while craftsmen adapted their skills to create tools that might prove effective against threats that required approaches combining physical action with spiritual preparation. Marcus realized that his carefully preserved archives had suddenly transformed from academic curiosities into practical manuals that could provide guidance for those who would bear the responsibility of defending reality itself against forces whose very existence posed challenges that extended far beyond the merely military. The scholar gathered his most critical documents and prepared to leave the relative safety of his tower, understanding that knowledge possessed value only when it could be shared with those who had both the courage and the capability to transform information into action that could make the difference between victory and defeat in conflicts where the stakes included not just individual survival, but the continued existence of everything that made mortal life meaningful. The transformation of the imperial city from a center of earthly power into a battlefield where cosmic forces clashed with consequences that would reshape the fundamental nature of reality had begun with a silence that contained more meaning than any sound could have conveyed. And as Marcus prepared to carry his burden of knowledge into the chaos that was spreading like ripples from stones thrown into the still pool of ordinary existence, he understood that the true test of everything he had learned during his decades of quiet scholarship was about to begin in circumstances that would require him to discover reserves of courage he had never imagined he might possess. When the moment came to choose between safety and service in the face of darkness that threatened to consume not just the empire, but the very possibility of hope itself. In the darkest hour, when chaos seemed to reign supreme, and the familiar landmarks of civilization crumbled beneath the weight of forces that operated according to principles no mortal mind had ever been designed to comprehend, unexpected heroes emerged like dawn breaking over distant mountains, their coming heralded not by trumpets or proclamations, but by the quiet recognition that some individuals possess within themselves the capacity to transform despair into hope through actions that transcend the boundaries of what should be possible for creatures born of flesh and bound by mortality. The first of these unlikely champions appeared in the depths of the Imperial prison, a figure whose past remained shrouded in mystery, but whose presence seemed to carry with it an aura of destiny that even the hardened guards could sense without fully understanding its implications. This individual, known to history only as the prisoner, possessed qualities that set them apart from ordinary mortals in ways that became apparent only when circumstances demanded the kind of courage that most people discover they lack when faced with challenges that extend beyond the merely personal into realms where individual choice can determine the fate of entire civilizations. Marcus first became aware of this extraordinary person through reports that filtered up from the lower levels of the palace complex, accounts of someone who had been selected by Emperor Uriel Septim himself to serve as a messenger in the final hours before the assassination that would sever the mystical connection between the dragon fires and the divine power that had sustained them for over 4 centuries. The scholar's contacts among the palace staff spoke in hushed tones of meetings conducted in the deepest chambers of the prison, conversations between the aging emperor and this mysterious figure that seemed to carry weight far beyond what could be explained by normal considerations of political expediency or administrative necessity. The details of these encounters remained classified at levels that prevented even Marcus from accessing the official records, but fragments of information suggested that Uriel Septim had recognized in the prisoner qualities that marked them as one of those rare individuals whose arrival at crucial moments in history was not coincidental but rather the result of cosmic forces that guided suitable candidates towards situations where their unique combination of skills and character traits could be applied to challenges that required solutions operating beyond conventional categories of problem and response. While the prisoner began their journey from the shadows of imperial captivity toward a destiny that would reshape the fundamental nature of reality itself, another figure was awakening to responsibilities that he had never imagined would fall upon his shoulders. In the chapel of Akatosh, in the city of Kavach, Brother Martin Septim pursued his scholarly studies of divine philosophy with the dedication of a man who had found peace in contemplation of eternal truths, unaware that the dragon blood flowing in his veins carried obligations that would soon transform him from a quiet priest into the most important person in the empire. Marcus had been following Martin's intellectual development through their correspondence for several years, recognizing in the young cleric a mind capable of grasping the complex relationships between theological theory and practical mysticism that would prove essential for understanding the true nature of the crisis that was overwhelming the established order. Martin's letters revealed someone who approached questions of divine intervention and cosmic responsibility with the careful precision of a scholar, combined with the spiritual insight of one who had genuinely experienced communion with forces that transcended the boundaries of mortal existence. The transformation of these two individuals from anonymous figures living on the margins of imperial society into the central actors in a drama that would determine whether reality itself could be preserved intact began when the Mythic Dawn's carefully orchestrated assault finally reached its climactic phase. The assassination of Emperor Uriel Septim VII was carried out with precision that spoke of decades of preparation, but the cultists who struck the fatal blow discovered that their victim faced death with the calm acceptance of one who understood that his sacrifice was necessary to set in motion events that would ultimately lead to their own defeat through mechanisms they could not anticipate or prevent. The prisoner's escape from the chaos surrounding the emperor's death was facilitated by knowledge that could only have come from prophetic dreams, guidance that led them through passages known only to those who had studied the palace's hidden architecture for purposes that extended beyond mere security considerations. Their journey from the depths of the imperial prison to the broader world of a Tamriel under siege by forces from beyond the boundaries of structured reality was marked by encounters that seemed coincidental, but followed patterns that suggested intervention by intelligences operating on scales too vast for ordinary comprehension. Marcus learned of Martin Septim's true heritage through channels that connected the deepest levels of imperial intelligence with academic networks that had been developed over generations to preserve and transmit knowledge that could not be safely recorded in official documents. The revelation that the humble priest of Kavach was actually the unacknowledged son of the murdered emperor came with instructions for providing him with access to texts that would help him understand the mystical responsibilities that came with dragon blood, obligations that could not be refused without consequences, that would extend far beyond personal considerations into realms where individual choice determined cosmic outcomes. The scholar found himself cast in the role of advisor and guide to heroes whose capabilities exceeded anything he had encountered in his decades of study. Individuals whose understanding of complex theoretical principles seemed to develop through intuitive leaps that bypassed the normal processes of academic learning and went directly to practical applications that produced results under conditions where conventional approaches failed completely. Working with the prisoner and Martin Septim required Marcus to expand his own understanding of how knowledge could be transformed into action when circumstances demanded solutions that incorporated elements from multiple disciplines, including areas of study that most scholars avoided because of their inherent dangers. The Blades, that ancient organization dedicated to protecting the emperor and preserving the mystical foundations of imperial power, emerged from shadows where they had maintained vigilance for generations to serve as guardians and teachers for heroes whose destiny would require them to master skills that combined martial prowess with spiritual development in proportions that few individuals had ever achieved successfully. Under the leadership of Grandmaster Jafra, these legendary warriors provided training that prepared the prisoner and Martin Septim for challenges that would test every aspect of their character, while providing them with tools that could be effective against enemies whose nature transcended the merely physical. The convergence of these extraordinary individuals with the knowledge that Marcus had preserved and the expertise that the Blades had maintained created a synthesis that represented the Empire's best hope for surviving the crisis that threatened not just political stability, but the continued existence of reality in forms that could support mortal life. Their collaboration developed through shared experiences of danger and discovery that forged bonds stronger than those created by normal social processes, relationships based on mutual recognition of capabilities and commitments that extended beyond personal considerations into realms where friendship became a cosmic force that could influence outcomes on scales that encompassed entire dimensions. The scholar's role in this unlikely alliance evolved from providing historical context and theoretical understanding to serving as a bridge between the academic knowledge preserved in ancient texts and the practical wisdom that could be applied to challenges that required immediate action under conditions where mistakes could have consequences extending across multiple planes of existence. His careful documentation of Daedric lore proved invaluable when the heroes needed to understand the motivations and capabilities of enemies whose psychology operated according to principles that bore no resemblance to mortal thought patterns, while his maps of ancient Islade wayshrine networks provided guidance for movements that could take advantage of mystical pathways invisible to conventional surveillance. Martin Septim's acceptance of his heritage as the last heir of the Septim dynasty was accomplished with the grace of one who understood that greatness was not a reward to be claimed, but a burden to be carried with dignity and determination, regardless of personal preferences or the sacrifice of dreams that had provided meaning and direction before destiny revealed the true scope of responsibilities that came with dragon blood. His transformation from contemplative priest to mystical emperor required not just intellectual understanding of theoretical principles, but spiritual preparation that enabled him to serve as a conduit for divine power without being consumed by energies that could easily overwhelm minds unprepared for direct communion with forces that operated on cosmic scales. The prisoner's journey, from anonymous captive to legendary hero, followed pathways that seemed to have been prepared in advance by intelligences that understood how individual choice and character development could be guided through experiences that revealed hidden capabilities while providing opportunities for growth that prepared suitable candidates for roles that could not be filled through normal processes of selection and training. Their adventures across a Tamriel besieged by interdimensional invaders became legends that inspired others to discover their own capacity for heroism. When circumstances demanded actions that transcended the boundaries of what most people believed possible for mortals faced with challenges that seemed to require divine intervention. The quiet convergence of these heroes with the resources and knowledge that Marcus and the Blades could provide created a foundation for resistance that gave hope to citizens who had begun to despair that their world could be saved from forces whose very presence seemed to corrupt the fundamental laws that governed existence itself. Their alliance represented more than just a military coalition or political partnership. It was a synthesis of different types of power and understanding that created possibilities for victory that had not existed before their paths crossed in the crucible of crisis that was transforming every aspect of life throughout the Empire. As the heroes prepared for challenges that would test everything they had learned and push their capabilities to limits that might prove beyond what even their extraordinary natures could endure, Marcus felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that his years of scholarly preparation had contributed to the emergence of hope from circumstances that had seemed to offer nothing but despair. Understanding that the true measure of knowledge was not its accumulation but its application in service of causes that extended beyond personal advancement into realms where wisdom became a weapon that could be wielded against darkness that threatened to extinguish the very possibility of light. The final resolution came not with violence, but with transformation, as the last heir of the Septim line chose love of his people over love of his own mortal existence, understanding with the clarity that comes only to those who have glimpsed the true nature of cosmic responsibility, that some battles can be won only through sacrifice that transcends the boundaries between individual desire and universal necessity, creating victory from defeat through alchemy that transforms personal loss into eternal gain for all who would inherit the consequences of choices made in moments when heroism becomes indistinguishable from love. Marcus stood among the crowd that had gathered in the great plaza before the Temple of the One, watching as Martin Septim prepared to make the choice that would save reality itself at the cost of his own individual existence. The young priest-emperor, moving through the final ritual with the calm dignity of one who had found peace in accepting a destiny that demanded everything he was and everything he might have become in service of preserving everything that others held dear. The scholar felt tears streaming down his face as he witnessed the culmination of events that had begun with his discovery of ancient prophecies in the deepest archives of Imperial knowledge, understanding that all his years of study had led to this moment when theoretical understanding would be transformed into practical salvation through the willing sacrifice of someone who embodied the highest ideals of both scholarship and service. The ritual that Martin performed was not recorded in any text that Marcus had studied, yet its elements seemed familiar from fragments preserved in documents so ancient that their origins predated the formation of human civilization, suggesting that the knowledge necessary for this ultimate working had been encoded in the mystical architecture of the Empire itself, waiting for the moment when circumstances would require its activation by someone whose combination of dragon blood and spiritual preparation made them capable of serving as a conduit for forces that operated on scales encompassing multiple dimensions simultaneously. As the priest-emperor spoke words in languages that seemed to bypass normal hearing and register directly in the consciousness of all who were present, reality itself began to respond with changes that started subtly but grew more pronounced as the ritual progressed toward its inevitable climax. The air shimmered with energies that made colors more vivid and sounds more resonant, as if the fundamental constants that governed sensory experience were being adjusted to accommodate the manifestation of power that existed normally only in realms where mortal flesh could not survive direct exposure to divine essence, concentrated beyond the normal limits of what structured existence could contain. Martin's physical form began to dissolve not through destruction, but through transformation, his individual identity merging with forces that had shaped the cosmos during epochs, when the distinction between creator and creation remained fluid enough to permit conscious beings to participate directly in the ongoing process of reality formation. The dissolution was beautiful rather than terrible, a metamorphosis that spoke of transcendence rather than loss, as if the priest-emperor was not dying, but rather expanding beyond the limitations of singular existence into something that could exist simultaneously across multiple planes of being. The golden light that rose from Martin's transforming essence expanded upward to meet the encroaching darkness of Mehrunes Dagon's direct manifestation in the mortal realm, and the collision between these opposed forces created effects that challenged every assumption about the nature of conflict and resolution. Rather than the violent explosion that observers expected, the meeting of ultimate order and ultimate chaos produced a synthesis that seemed to rewrite the fundamental laws governing the interaction between different types of cosmic power, creating new possibilities for existence that incorporated elements from both divine stability and daedric change without being dominated by either. Marcus watched in wonder as the Prince of Destruction found himself constrained not by superior force, but by the willing love that Martin had poured into his sacrifice. Discovering that power, motivated by compassion for others, possessed qualities that could neutralize aggression driven by desire for personal dominance through mechanisms that operated according to principles more fundamental than strength or cunning. The Daedric Prince's retreat was not a military defeat, but rather a philosophical recognition that some battles cannot be won, because victory itself would violate the cosmic balance that allows consciousness to exist in forms capable of appreciating the beauty that emerges from properly ordered relationships between opposing forces. The transformation of the cosmic barriers that protected Mundus from unwanted interdimensional intrusion was accomplished through methods that incorporated elements of the old system while adding new features that made future violations far more difficult to achieve. The mystical infrastructure that had depended on the continuous sacrifice of dragon-born emperors was replaced by arrangements that drew their power from the collective will of all conscious beings who chose to participate in the maintenance of structured reality, creating a more democratic foundation for cosmic defense that could not be disrupted by eliminating individual key figures through assassination or corruption. The scholar understood that he was witnessing not just the end of a particular crisis, but the birth of a new age in which the relationship between mortals and the forces that shaped their existence would be characterized by greater participation and shared responsibility, replacing systems that had concentrated cosmic authority in the hands of divinely appointed rulers, with arrangements that recognized the capacity of ordinary individuals to contribute meaningfully to the preservation and development of civilized existence when circumstances provided them with opportunities to discover their own potential for heroism. The immediate aftermath of Martin's sacrifice was marked by profound silence as reality settled into its new configuration, the fundamental changes in cosmic architecture requiring time for integration that allowed all conscious beings to adjust to altered conditions without experiencing the disorientation that might have resulted from more abrupt transitions. The Oblivion Gates that had torn holes in the fabric of space began closing automatically as the modified barriers made it impossible for them to maintain stable connection between dimensions. Their closure, accompanied by healing effects that repaired the damage their presence had inflicted on the structural integrity of local reality. Citizens throughout the Imperial city found themselves able to breathe more easily as the oppressive atmosphere created by interdimensional distortion dissipated, replaced by air that seemed cleaner and more invigorating than anything they had experienced during the months of crisis that had tested every assumption about the reliability of the world they had inherited from previous generations. Children who had been born during the period of dimensional instability displayed remarkable resilience in adapting to the new cosmic conditions, suggesting that the changes brought about by Martin's sacrifice had created improvements that would benefit future generations in ways that could not yet be fully understood. Marcus felt a profound sense of completion as he realized that his life's work had contributed to outcomes that exceeded anything he had dared to hope when he first began his studies of ancient texts that seemed to contain nothing more than historical curiosities and theoretical speculation. The knowledge he had preserved and shared had become tools that enabled heroes to achieve victory over forces that threatened not just the Empire, but the continued existence of everything that made mortal life meaningful, transforming academic research into practical salvation through applications that demonstrated the ultimate unity between theoretical understanding and practical wisdom. The scholar began planning the documentation that would preserve accurate accounts of these extraordinary events for future generations who would need to understand how ordinary individuals had discovered within themselves the capacity to reshape reality through choices that transcended personal considerations and embraced responsibilities that extended across dimensions where the consequences of heroic action could influence outcomes on scales that encompassed entire universes, ensuring that the lessons learned during this crisis would remain available to guide those who would face challenges that had not yet been imagined but would require similar combinations of courage, wisdom, and love to resolve successfully. As the golden light of Martin's transformation faded into memory, but left behind changes that would endure, for as long as consciousness continued to exist in forms capable of appreciating beauty and choosing good over evil, Marcus understood that he had been privileged to witness the kind of event that occurs perhaps once in the lifetime of entire civilizations, a moment when the boundary between legend and history dissolves and reveals that the greatest stories are those that emerge from the choices made by individuals who discover that they possess within themselves the capacity to become everything that heroes in the oldest tales had always represented, proving that the ultimate magic is not the manipulation of external forces, but the transformation of the human heart in service of love that encompasses not just family or tribe, but the entire community of conscious beings who share the gift of existence in a universe where hope remains possible as long as there are those willing to sacrifice personal desires for the greater good that benefits everyone who will inherit the world that heroes leave behind. In the gentle silence that followed the storm, the Empire began to understand that it had been not just saved, but fundamentally transformed, its very essence altered by forces that had touched every stone of every building and every heart of every citizen with changes so profound that the world, emerging from the crisis, bore only superficial resemblance to the one that had existed before reality itself had been tested in the crucible of cosmic conflict and emerged stronger for having survived the experience of dissolution and renewal. Marcus found himself walking through streets that looked familiar, but felt different in ways that defied easy description, as if the Imperial city had been rebuilt using the same materials, but according to architectural principles that incorporated lessons learned during the brief period when the boundaries between dimensions had grown thin enough to allow influence from realms where beauty and function achieved synthesis impossible under normal physical constraints. Buildings stood in the same locations they had always occupied, yet their proportions seemed more pleasing to the eye, their angles more conducive to the kind of contemplation that encouraged peaceful thoughts, and their materials more responsive to the emotional states of those who lived and worked within their walls. The transformation extended far beyond mere aesthetic improvements into realms of fundamental change that affected the basic relationships between consciousness and environment in ways that made daily life more harmonious without sacrificing the individual freedoms that had always characterized the best aspects of Imperial civilization. citizens reported that their dreams had become more vivid and more meaningful, filled with insights that helped them solve problems they had been struggling with during waking hours, while their interactions with neighbors displayed levels of empathy and understanding that seemed to emerge naturally from exposure to cosmic forces that had temporarily dissolved the artificial barriers separating one mind from another. The scholar spent long hours documenting these changes, recording testimonies from citizens whose experiences provided evidence that the modifications in reality's fundamental structure had created opportunities for human development that transcended the limitations which had previously constrained the growth of consciousness toward its fullest potential. Merchants discovered that their negotiations proceeded more smoothly when all parties approached transactions with genuine concern for mutual benefit rather than pure self-interest, while artisans found that their work achieved levels of beauty and craftsmanship that had previously required decades of training to accomplish, as if the cosmic energies released during the crisis had enhanced the natural talents that existed within every individual. The political structures that had governed the empire for centuries required extensive modification to accommodate the new reality in which ultimate authority could no longer be concentrated in the hands of a single individual whose divine appointment provided legitimacy for decisions that affected millions of lives. The absence of a living emperor with dragon blood necessitated the development of governmental systems that drew their power from the collective will of citizens who understood that their participation in the maintenance of cosmic order was not just a privilege but a responsibility that required continuous attention to the balance between individual freedom and social harmony. Marcus participated in the lengthy discussions that shaped these new arrangements, contributing historical perspective that helped political theorists understand how previous attempts at democratic governance had failed when they ignored the mystical dimensions of authority that connected earthly power to cosmic forces, operating according to principles that transcended purely human considerations. The solution that emerged from these deliberations incorporated elements from both imperial tradition and innovative approaches to shared responsibility, creating institutions that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining the stability necessary for long-term planning and development. The Elder Council expanded its role from advisory body to active governing assembly, but its membership was restructured to include representatives from groups that had previously been excluded from direct participation in imperial decision-making, ensuring that policies reflected the needs and perspectives of all citizens rather than just those whose wealth or birth had traditionally provided access to political influence. The selection processes for these positions incorporated mystical elements that tested candidates' capacity to serve the greater good even when doing so required personal sacrifice, using techniques adapted from methods that had once been used to identify potential emperors among the scattered descendants of ancient bloodlines. The Mages Guild found itself transformed from an organization primarily concerned with theoretical research and commercial applications of magical knowledge into an institution responsible for maintaining the mystical infrastructure that now supported the Empire's continued existence, requiring its members to develop new areas of expertise that combine traditional arcane studies with disciplines that had previously been considered too dangerous or impractical for systematic investigation. The Guild's libraries expanded to include texts that had once been restricted to the deepest vaults of Imperial archives, making knowledge available to qualified students who demonstrated both the intellectual capacity and moral development necessary to handle information that could be used to reshape reality on scales that extended far beyond personal considerations. Marcus accepted appointment as Chief Archivist for the Imperial Historical Commission, a newly created institution tasked with preserving accurate records of the Oblivion crisis and its aftermath, while ensuring that future generations would have access to the knowledge necessary to prevent similar catastrophes. should circumstances ever again threaten the stability of the cosmic barriers that protected Mundus from unwanted interdimensional intrusion. His first major project involved creating comprehensive guides that explained the theoretical principles underlying the new arrangements for maintaining reality's structural integrity. Documents written in language accessible to educated citizens who might need to understand these concepts if their participation in cosmic defense ever became necessary. The scholar's new responsibilities required him to work closely with survivors of the crisis who had experienced direct contact with Daedric forces, interviewing heroes whose first-hand knowledge of interdimensional conflict provided insights that could not be obtained through purely academic research. These conversations revealed that the boundary between mortal consciousness and cosmic awareness had become more permeable during the period when reality's normal structure had been disrupted, allowing some individuals to retain abilities that enabled them to perceive potential threats to dimensional stability before they manifested as actual dangers requiring active intervention. The integration of these enhanced individuals into the Empire's defense systems created new challenges that required solutions combining administrative efficiency with mystical sensitivity, since their capabilities operated according to principles that could not be easily categorized using traditional bureaucratic methods. Special liaison positions were created to facilitate communication between conventional government agencies and personnel whose responsibilities extended into realms where standard operating procedures proved inadequate for situations that required responses incorporating elements from multiple dimensions of existence simultaneously. The economic systems that supported imperial civilization underwent modifications that reflected the increased prosperity that resulted from cosmic energies, enhancing the natural productivity of both agricultural and manufacturing activities, creating abundance that allowed for the implementation of social programs that had previously been considered too expensive to sustain, without imposing tax burdens that would have stifled the economic growth necessary to fund them. The improved efficiency of all forms of productive activity meant that citizens could achieve comfortable standards of living while working fewer hours, providing time for the educational and cultural development that democracy required if it was to function effectively over extended periods. Trade relationships with other provinces evolved to incorporate the mystical elements that now played more prominent roles in all aspects of imperial governance, requiring diplomats to develop skills that combine traditional negotiation techniques with understanding of how cosmic forces influenced regional variations in the fundamental laws governing economic activity. Provinces that had previously been considered peripheral to imperial interests found themselves playing more significant roles as their unique magical traditions contributed knowledge essential for maintaining the complex systems that now protected all of Tamriel from external interdimensional threats. The religious institutions that had provided spiritual guidance during the crisis discovered that their role in post-crisis society required expansion beyond traditional ceremonial functions into areas of practical mysticism that helped citizens understand their individual connections to the cosmic forces that influenced daily life, in ways that had become more apparent since the barriers between dimensions had been reconstructed according to principles that allowed greater interaction between mortal consciousness and divine intelligence. Temples became centers for education that combined theological instruction with practical training in techniques that enabled ordinary individuals to contribute meaningfully to the maintenance of cosmic harmony. The military forces that had defended the Empire during the interdimensional invasion required restructuring to address threats that could not be handled using conventional weapons and tactics, leading to the development of specialized units whose training incorporated elements from both martial disciplines and mystical practices that prepared soldiers to function effectively in environments where normal physical laws might be suspended or modified by hostile forces operating according to alien principles. These enhanced legions served not only as defensive forces, but also as exploration units capable of investigating dimensional anomalies that might herald the approach of future crises requiring early intervention to prevent their escalation into full-scale cosmic emergencies. Marcus found deep satisfaction in observing how the Empire's transformation had created opportunities for individual growth and social development that exceeded anything he had imagined possible when he first began his studies of ancient texts that seemed to contain only historical curiosities with little relevance to contemporary concerns. The knowledge he had preserved had become the foundation for educational systems that enabled citizens to understand their roles in maintaining the cosmic balance that protected their civilization from external threats, while providing them with tools for personal development that enhanced their capacity to contribute meaningfully to the creation of a society that served the needs of all its members rather than just those fortunate enough to possess advantages of birth or circumstance. The scholars' evening walks through the transformed Imperial city became meditations on the nature of change and continuity, opportunities to observe how familiar landmarks had been subtly modified by exposure to cosmic forces that enhanced their beauty and functionality while preserving the essential characteristics that provided psychological anchors for citizens adapting to new realities that required expanded understanding of their relationship to forces operating on scales that encompassed dimensions beyond those accessible to normal sensory experience. The peaceful atmosphere that now pervaded the city reflected not just the absence of immediate threats, but the presence of positive influences that encouraged cooperation and mutual support among individuals whose enhanced awareness of their interconnectedness made conflicts based on purely selfish considerations seem both unnecessary and counterproductive. As months passed, and the initial adjustments to post-crisis conditions settled into routines that felt natural rather than imposed, Marcus began to understand that the Empire had not simply survived the Oblivion crisis, but had used the experience as a catalyst for evolutionary development that might not have been possible under normal circumstances, emerging from the crucible of cosmic conflict as something that retained the best elements of its previous incarnation, while adding capabilities that prepared it to face challenges that would require wisdom and strength, operating in combination rather than in isolation from each other. The greatest truths emerged not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet contemplation that followed, as wise minds traced the deeper patterns that connected individual choices to cosmic consequences, revealing that the Oblivion crisis had been not merely a threat to be defeated, but a test designed by forces operating on scales too vast for mortal comprehension, to evaluate whether consciousness had evolved sufficiently to assume greater responsibility for maintaining the balance between order and chaos that allowed existence itself to continue in forms capable of supporting the growth of awareness toward its ultimate potential. Marcus dedicated long hours to philosophical reflection on the implications of everything he had witnessed and experienced during the crisis and its aftermath, understanding that the surface narrative of heroes defeating villains masked deeper truths about the nature of reality and consciousness that could only be appreciated through careful analysis of the patterns that connected seemingly unrelated events into a coherent whole that revealed the presence of intelligence operating according to principles that transcended the limitations of individual perspective and embraced perspectives that incorporated multiple dimensions of existence simultaneously. The scholar's analysis began with recognition that the timing of the crisis had not been coincidental, but rather the result of cosmic cycles that brought different types of challenges to consciousness, at intervals determined by the rate at which awareness expanded beyond its previous limitations, and required new tests to determine whether further growth was possible or whether stagnation had set in that would require external intervention to break through barriers that prevented continued development. The Mythic Dawn's assault on reality had succeeded not because of their own power, but because the existing system of cosmic defense had reached the end of its effective lifespan and needed replacement by arrangements that incorporated lessons learned during previous cycles of challenge and response. The deeper pattern that Marcus discerned suggested that consciousness itself was engaged in a process of evolutionary development that required periodic exposure to existential threats that could only be overcome through the discovery of capabilities that had previously remained dormant or undeveloped, creating situations where survival depended on transcending previous limitations and embracing expanded awareness of the interconnectedness that linked individual existence to cosmic forces operating on scales that encompassed multiple universes existing in parallel dimensions, where different possibilities could be explored simultaneously without creating contradictions that would destabilize the overall structure of reality. The role played by individual choice in determining cosmic outcomes revealed that consciousness possessed far greater influence over the fundamental laws governing existence than most people had previously understood, suggesting that reality was not a fixed structure imposed by external authorities, but rather a collaborative creation maintained through the conscious participation of all beings whose awareness had developed sufficiently to recognize their capacity to contribute meaningfully to the ongoing process of universal development through decisions that reflected understanding of how personal actions could affect outcomes extending far beyond the immediate circumstances that prompted them. Martin Septim's ultimate sacrifice demonstrated that love possessed transformative power that could alter the fundamental nature of cosmic forces, converting destructive energies into constructive influences through mechanisms that operated according to principles more fundamental than physical laws or magical techniques, revealing that consciousness motivated by genuine concern for the welfare of others could access capabilities that transcended normal limitations and achieved results that seemed impossible when evaluated using conventional criteria, but proved entirely natural when understood from perspectives that incorporated awareness of the deeper unity underlying apparent diversity and conflict. The prisoner's journey, from anonymous captive to legendary hero, illustrated how destiny operated, not through predetermined fate, but through the provision of opportunities for individuals whose character development had prepared them to recognize and respond appropriately to situations that required capabilities they possessed but had not previously needed to exercise, suggesting that heroism was not an innate quality that some people possessed while others lacked, but rather a potential that existed within all consciousness and could be activated when circumstances provided suitable catalysts for its expression. Marcus realized that his own role in the events that had reshaped the empire exemplified how knowledge accumulated through patient study could be transformed into practical wisdom when combined with willingness to risk personal safety in service of goals that extended beyond individual considerations, demonstrating that scholarship possessed value not as an end in itself, but as a means of preparing consciousness to contribute effectively to collective efforts that required understanding of complex relationships between different aspects of existence that could only be mastered through disciplines that combined intellectual rigor with spiritual development. The transformation of imperial society following the crisis revealed that social structures possessed far greater flexibility than most people had assumed, capable of adapting rapidly to new conditions when changes were motivated by shared understanding of principles that served the common good rather than narrow interests that benefited only limited groups at the expense of broader community welfare, suggesting that political arrangements should be evaluated not according to their adherence to traditional forms, but according to their effectiveness in creating conditions that supported the continued development of consciousness toward greater awareness of its potential for positive influence on cosmic outcomes. The enhanced abilities that some individuals had retained following their exposure to interdimensional forces during the crisis provided evidence that consciousness possessed latent capabilities that could be activated through appropriate experiences, indicating that the normal limitations that seemed to constrain human potential were not absolute boundaries, but rather temporary restrictions that could be transcended when circumstances provided sufficient motivation and support for the kind of growth that required abandoning familiar assumptions about the nature of individual identity and embracing expanded awareness of connection to forces operating on cosmic scales. The mystical infrastructure that now supported the Empire's continued existence demonstrated that technology and spirituality could be integrated in ways that enhanced both material prosperity and spiritual development, creating systems that served practical needs while providing opportunities for consciousness to expand its understanding of how individual actions contributed to the maintenance of cosmic harmony, suggesting that the traditional separation between secular and sacred activities had been based on incomplete understanding of how different aspects of existence were connected through patterns that encompassed multiple dimensions simultaneously. The scholar's meditation on these deeper patterns led him to understand that the Oblivion Crisis had been not just a historical event, but a transformation in the fundamental relationship between consciousness and cosmos that created new possibilities for development that had not previously existed, opening pathways for growth that could lead to forms of awareness that transcended current limitations while maintaining connection to the essential qualities that made individual existence meaningful and valuable as a component of the larger pattern that encompassed all possible forms of consciousness. The implications of these insights extended far beyond the immediate concerns of imperial governance into realms of cosmic philosophy that suggested consciousness was participating in processes of universal development that operated according to principles that could only be understood through direct experience of the kind that came through willingness to accept responsibility for outcomes that extended beyond personal considerations and embraced concern for the welfare of all beings whose existence was connected through networks of influence that spanned multiple dimensions where different aspects of the same fundamental reality could be explored simultaneously. Marcus began to see his continued work as archivist and educator not just as professional responsibility, but as participation in cosmic processes that required the preservation and transmission of wisdom gained through experiences that had revealed new aspects of the relationship between individual consciousness and universal principles, understanding that knowledge possessed value only when it was shared with others who could use it to continue the process of development that had been catalyzed by the crisis, but would require ongoing attention and commitment if its benefits were to be sustained and extended to future generations who would inherit both opportunities and responsibilities that current understanding could only begin to appreciate. The quiet revelations that emerged from contemplating the deeper meaning of recent events suggested that reality was far more responsive to conscious intention than most people had previously understood, indicating that the future development of civilization would depend not just on technological advancement or political reform, but on the expansion of awareness that enabled individuals to recognize their capacity to influence cosmic outcomes through choices that reflected understanding of how personal actions connected to universal patterns that encompassed scales of existence, extending from the most intimate aspects of individual experience to the most comprehensive dimensions of cosmic architecture. As the scholar continued his work of documenting and interpreting the lessons learned during the crisis, he understood that his efforts were contributing to preparations for future challenges that would require even greater levels of consciousness and cooperation than had been necessary to survive the Oblivion Crisis. Recognizing that each successful response to existential threats created conditions that enabled consciousness to face increasingly complex tests of its capacity to maintain cosmic balance while continuing to evolve toward forms of awareness that could encompass understanding of principles that currently remain beyond the reach of even the most advanced forms of individual development. Like gentle rain nourishing future gardens, the stories of the crisis began to take root in the hearts of those who would shape tomorrow, spreading through the empire, not as mere historical accounts, but as living wisdom that transformed the way people understood their relationship to forces that operated beyond the boundaries of ordinary experience, creating a cultural foundation that would prepare future generations to face challenges that had not yet been imagined, but would require the same combination of courage, wisdom, and love that had enabled their predecessors to emerge victorious from the crucible of cosmic conflict. Marcus found himself at the center of efforts to preserve and transmit the lessons learned during the Oblivion crisis, working with storytellers and educators throughout the empire to ensure that the accounts passed down to children would capture not just the dramatic events that had reshaped reality, but the deeper truths about individual potential and collective responsibility that had made victory possible when all conventional wisdom suggested that defeat was inevitable. The scholar understood that the stories told to young minds would influence how they approached challenges throughout their lives, shaping their expectations about what ordinary people could accomplish when circumstances demanded extraordinary responses to threats that transcended normal categories of problem and solution. The official histories compiled under Marcus's supervision balanced accurate documentation of events with presentation of principles that could be applied to future situations requiring similar levels of dedication and sacrifice, creating texts that served both as historical records and as practical guides for those who might find themselves called upon to serve causes that extended beyond personal considerations into realms where individual choices could determine outcomes affecting entire civilizations. These accounts emphasized that heroism was not the exclusive province of individuals blessed with supernatural abilities, but rather the result of character development that enabled ordinary people to discover capabilities they had not known they possessed when faced with challenges that required them to transcend previous limitations. The stories that emerged from the crisis and spread throughout Imperial culture highlighted the importance of preparation that combined intellectual understanding with spiritual development, showing how Marcus's decades of scholarly research had provided essential knowledge when the moment came to apply theoretical principles to practical challenges, while Martin Septim's religious studies had prepared him to serve as a conduit for divine power, despite never having anticipated that his quiet life of contemplation would be transformed by revelations of heritage and responsibility that demanded the ultimate sacrifice in service of universal welfare. Children throughout the empire listened with rapt attention to tales of the prisoner, whose journey from captivity to legendary status demonstrated that destiny operated not through predetermined fate, but through the recognition of opportunities to serve purposes greater than personal advancement, understanding that their own futures might hold possibilities for contribution to causes that would require them to develop qualities of courage and wisdom that could only be cultivated through disciplines that prepared consciousness to respond appropriately when circumstances demanded choices between safety and service to the greater good. The cultural institutions that had provided entertainment and education during the empire's peaceful years adapted their offerings to incorporate themes and lessons derived from the crisis, creating new forms of artistic expression that helped citizens process the psychological impact of having witnessed reality itself undergo fundamental transformation, while providing models for behavior that could guide future responses to challenges requiring collective action, coordinated across multiple levels of society simultaneously. Theater companies developed performances that dramatized the key moments of the crisis, while emphasizing the human elements that had made divine intervention possible, showing audiences that the greatest magic was not the manipulation of external forces, but the transformation of individual consciousness in service of love that encompassed all beings. Marcus worked closely with the bards and musicians who traveled between settlements carrying news and entertainment, helping them craft songs and stories that would preserve the essential truths about the crisis while adapting their presentation to audiences with different levels of education and experience, ensuring that farmers and craftsmen could appreciate the same fundamental lessons that scholars and nobles studied in more theoretical forms. These traveling performers became inadvertent philosophers, carrying wisdom gained through cosmic crisis to remote communities where it could take root and flourish according to local conditions, while maintaining connection to universal principles that transcended cultural boundaries. The educational reforms that followed the crisis incorporated storytelling techniques that helped students understand complex relationships between individual development and cosmic responsibility, using narrative approaches that made abstract principles accessible to young minds while providing frameworks for understanding how personal choices connected to outcomes operating on scales that encompassed multiple dimensions of existence simultaneously. Teachers throughout the empire received training that enabled them to present these materials in ways that encouraged critical thinking while inspiring commitment to values that supported continued social and spiritual development. The scholars' collaboration with religious institutions resulted in the creation of new liturgical materials that incorporated insights gained during the crisis into traditional ceremonial forms, helping worshippers understand their individual connections to divine forces while emphasizing their responsibilities for maintaining the cosmic balance that protected all conscious beings from threats that operated beyond the reach of purely human capabilities. These reformed religious practices encouraged active participation in mystical processes rather than passive reception of divine grace, preparing citizens to serve as conscious partners in the maintenance of spiritual infrastructure that supported civilized existence. The military academies that trained future defenders of the empire developed curricula that combined traditional tactical instruction with education about the mystical dimensions of conflict that had become apparent during the interdimensional invasion, preparing officers to recognize and respond to threats that could not be addressed using conventional weapons and strategies, while fostering understanding of how individual courage could influence outcomes that extended far beyond immediate battlefield considerations. These enhanced training programs produced leaders who understood their roles not just as military commanders, but as guardians of cosmic principles that required protection through means that incorporated both physical prowess and spiritual development. Marcus noted with satisfaction how the stories emerging from the crisis inspired citizens to pursue their own development with greater dedication and sense of purpose, understanding that the ordinary activities of daily life provided opportunities for the kind of character building that could prepare individuals to respond appropriately if circumstances ever again required extraordinary actions in service of causes that transcended personal considerations. Merchants began conducting their business with greater attention to ethical principles, craftsmen approached their work as forms of meditation that contributed to cosmic harmony, and farmers understood their cultivation of the land as participation in processes that connected earthly productivity to spiritual principles operating on universal scales. The international relationships that connected the empire to other regions of Tamriel evolved to incorporate recognition that the lessons learned during the crisis possessed relevance that extended beyond imperial borders, creating opportunities for cultural exchange that shared wisdom while respecting the autonomy of different societies to adapt universal principles according to their own traditions and circumstances. Diplomatic missions that had once focused primarily on trade agreements and military alliances began including scholars and spiritual teachers whose presence facilitated deeper understanding between peoples who had previously related to each other mainly through political and economic considerations. The scholars' work evolved beyond documentation and preservation to include active cultivation of the next generation of thinkers and leaders who would inherit responsibility for maintaining the gains achieved through crisis and sacrifice, understanding that the true test of the empire's transformation would come not in the immediate aftermath of victory, but in the decades and centuries that followed, when the memory of cosmic threat faded and the temptation to return to purely material concerns might undermine the spiritual foundations that had made survival possible. Marcus established educational programs that combined rigorous intellectual training with practical experience in community service, preparing young people to understand their roles as conscious participants in ongoing cosmic processes rather than passive recipients of benefits achieved through the sacrifices of previous generations. The legacy that emerged from the Oblivion crisis encompassed far more than political reform or mystical enhancement, extending into realms of cultural development that prepared Imperial civilization to serve as an example for other societies facing similar challenges to their continued existence and development, demonstrating that consciousness possessed the capacity to transcend apparent limitations and achieve outcomes that seemed impossible when evaluated using conventional criteria, but proved entirely natural when understood from perspectives that incorporated awareness of the deeper unity underlying all manifestations of existence across multiple dimensions, where different aspects of the same fundamental reality could be explored and developed simultaneously. As the years passed, and the immediate trauma of the crisis faded into memory, Marcus observed with quiet pride how the stories and lessons preserved during those crucial months continued to influence decisions and inspire actions that contributed to the Empire's continued growth and development. Understanding that his work as chronicler and educator had participated in processes that extended far beyond historical documentation into realms of cultural transmission that would continue to shape consciousness for generations yet to come, ensuring that the wisdom gained through cosmic conflict would remain available to guide future responses to challenges that would test whether the lessons of the past had been truly learned and integrated into the foundations of a civilization worthy of the sacrifices that had been made to preserve its continued existence. As all stories must, this one draws to its gentle close, like the setting sun painting the sky in peaceful hues, while the Imperial city settled into its new existence as something far more than a mere seat of earthly power, having been transformed through trial by cosmic fire into a living symbol of what consciousness could accomplish when individual will aligned with universal purpose, creating harmony between the material needs of civilization and the spiritual requirements of beings whose destiny extended beyond the boundaries of mortal experience into realms where true fulfillment could only be achieved through service to causes that encompassed the welfare of all existence. Marcus found deep satisfaction in his evening walks through the transformed city, observing how familiar landmarks had been subtly enhanced by exposure to cosmic forces that brought out qualities of beauty and function that had always been present but required extraordinary circumstances to manifest fully. Understanding that the changes he witnessed in architecture and atmosphere reflected deeper transformations in the consciousness of citizens whose experiences during the crisis had revealed capabilities they had not known they possessed and responsibilities they had not previously understood were theirs to embrace. The streets through which the scholar walked bore traces of the battle that had reshaped reality itself, but these remnants appeared not as scars marking destruction, but as memorial elements that reminded observers of the price that had been paid for the peace they now enjoyed, creating opportunities for reflection on the relationship between sacrifice and renewal that operated as a fundamental principle governing all processes of growth and development, whether they occurred on individual or cosmic scales. Children played games in squares where interdimensional portals had once threatened to tear holes in the fabric of existence, their laughter serving as testament to the victory of hope over despair and life over the forces that would have reduced all consciousness to uniform emptiness. The palace complex that had once housed the mysterious workings of imperial power now served as an educational center where citizens could learn about their roles in maintaining the mystical infrastructure that protected their civilization from external threats, while providing opportunities for personal development that prepared them to contribute meaningfully to collective efforts requiring understanding of how individual actions connected to outcomes operating on scales that encompassed multiple dimensions simultaneously. The archives where Marcus had spent decades in quiet research had been expanded and opened to qualified students whose studies would continue the work of preserving and transmitting knowledge that might prove essential for future challenges, requiring responses that combined intellectual rigor with spiritual insight. The Temple of the One stood as a monument to the transformation that had saved reality itself. Its dragonfires now burning with flames that drew their sustenance, not from the sacrifice of individual emperors, but from the collective will of all citizens who chose to participate consciously in the maintenance of cosmic balance, creating a more democratic foundation for mystical defense that could not be disrupted through the elimination of key figures, but required ongoing commitment from entire populations whose understanding of their cosmic responsibilities had been enhanced through experiences that revealed the true nature of their relationship to forces operating beyond normal sensory perception. Marcus spent many quiet hours in contemplation within the temple, reflecting on the journey that had brought him from solitary scholarship to active participation in events that had reshaped the fundamental nature of existence. Understanding that his individual contribution had been possible only because of preparation that had begun decades before the crisis manifested, demonstrating that readiness for extraordinary service required patient cultivation of capabilities that might not be called upon for years or even lifetimes, but needed to be available when circumstances demanded responses that could not be improvised without adequate foundation in both knowledge and character development. The economic prosperity that followed the empire's transformation created conditions that allowed citizens to pursue activities beyond mere survival, providing time and resources for artistic expression, philosophical inquiry, and spiritual development that enriched the cultural life of communities throughout the realm, while generating innovations that improved material conditions without sacrificing the spiritual values that had enabled survival during the cosmic crisis. The enhanced productivity that resulted from the subtle influence of interdimensional energies meant that basic needs could be met with less effort, freeing consciousness to explore higher purposes that contributed to collective advancement, while providing opportunities for individual fulfillment that transcended purely material considerations. The scholar observed with wonder how the city's transformation had created environments that encouraged the kinds of interactions and reflections that supported continued growth and development, noting that conversations between strangers displayed levels of empathy and understanding that would have been remarkable during the pre-crisis period, but now seemed natural consequences of enhanced awareness that enabled individuals to recognize their fundamental interconnectedness despite apparent differences in background, occupation, or personal history. The barriers that had once separated people according to social class or economic status had not disappeared entirely, but had become more permeable, allowing for exchanges of knowledge and experience that enriched all participants while strengthening the social bonds that held the community together during both peaceful times and periods of challenge. The international recognition that the empire had earned through its successful response to the interdimensional crisis created opportunities for cultural exchange that brought new ideas and perspectives to imperial society, while allowing the wisdom gained through cosmic conflict to influence developments in other regions of Tamriel, demonstrating that consciousness possessed the capacity to learn from the experiences of others while contributing its own insights to collective understanding that benefited all participants in the ongoing process of civilization's evolution toward forms that could support higher levels of awareness and cooperation than had previously been achieved by any single society acting in isolation. The peaceful completion that Marcus witnessed in the imperial city's transformation represented not an ending but a new beginning. the establishment of foundations that could support continued development toward goals that remained only partially understood, but whose achievement would require the same combination of individual dedication and collective cooperation that had enabled survival during the crisis, suggesting that the ultimate purpose of the trials they had endured was not simply to restore previous conditions, but to create possibilities for advancement that had not existed before consciousness had been tested and proven capable of transcending apparent limitations through choices motivated by love rather than fear. The scholar's sense of completion came not from the resolution of all challenges, but from understanding that his life's work had contributed to creating conditions that would enable future generations to face their own trials with greater wisdom and better preparation. Recognizing that each successful response to existential threats created precedents and resources that could guide subsequent efforts to maintain the balance between order and chaos that allowed consciousness to continue evolving toward its ultimate potential for understanding and service. As Marcus prepared to pass his responsibilities to younger colleagues whose training had benefited from the lessons learned during the crisis, he felt the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing that individual effort had contributed to outcomes that extended far beyond personal accomplishment into realms of cosmic significance, where the welfare of entire universes could be influenced by the choices made by beings whose humble origins provided no indication of their capacity to participate in processes that operated on scales encompassing dimensions beyond those accessible to normal perception. Understanding that the greatest victories were those that created possibilities for future achievements that would exceed anything previously imagined possible for consciousness, exploring its infinite potential for growth and service in the vast community of beings whose existence was connected through networks of influence that spanned multiple realities where different aspects of the same fundamental truth could be discovered and developed simultaneously. And so, in the quiet places where memory keeps its vigil, this tale rests peacefully among all the stories that have ever been told, a gentle reminder that even when reality itself trembles on the edge of dissolution and the boundaries between worlds grow thin as morning mist, the choices made by hearts guided by love possess the power to weave existence back together into patterns more beautiful and enduring than anything that came before, proving that consciousness carries within itself the seeds of its own salvation when courage meets wisdom in service of purposes that transcend the limitations of individual desire. Marcus Valerius eventually took his rest among the heroes of his age, his archives carefully tended by successive generations of scholars who understood that the knowledge he had preserved represented more than historical curiosity or academic achievement, but rather tools that would remain essential for as long as consciousness continued to face challenges, requiring responses that combined intellectual understanding with spiritual insight, ensuring that future guardians of reality would have access to wisdom earned through trials that had tested every assumption about the nature of existence and revealed new possibilities for growth that extended beyond anything previously imagined possible. The Imperial Library, where the scholar had spent his most productive years, became a pilgrimage destination for students from throughout Tamriel who came to study the documents that chronicled the Oblivion crisis and its aftermath. Understanding that these texts contained lessons applicable to challenges that operated on any scale from personal development to cosmic defense, demonstrating that the principles underlying heroic action remained constant regardless of whether they were applied to individual struggles for self-improvement or collective efforts to preserve entire civilizations from threats that transcended normal categories of danger and response. In the deepest archives where Marcus had first discovered the ancient warnings that foreshadowed the crisis, new texts appeared periodically, as if placed there by invisible hands, documents that provided guidance for challenges that had not yet manifested but would require preparation that could only begin when consciousness possessed sufficient understanding of its role in maintaining the balance between forces that sought to preserve existing structures and those that promoted necessary change and development. These mysterious additions to the collection suggested that the cosmos itself participated in the education of beings whose evolution had reached levels that qualified them to serve as conscious partners in processes that encompassed multiple dimensions simultaneously. The stories of the prisoner and Martin Septim became legends that inspired countless individuals to pursue their own development with greater dedication and sense of purpose, understanding that destiny operated not through predetermined fate, but through the provision of opportunities for those whose character preparation had qualified them to recognize and respond appropriately when circumstances demanded choices between personal safety and service, to causes that extended beyond individual considerations into realms where heroism became indistinguishable from love, expressed through action that transcended normal limitations of courage and capability. The transformation of imperial society that had begun during the crisis continued to unfold over generations as citizens gradually learned to live according to principles that recognized their individual connections to cosmic forces while emphasizing their responsibilities for maintaining harmony between material needs and spiritual purposes, creating cultural forms that supported both practical prosperity and transcendent meaning in ways that previous civilizations had achieved only temporarily during exceptional periods when external circumstances forced rapid development that could not be sustained without the deeper understanding that came through deliberate cultivation rather than accidental discovery. The mystical infrastructure that protected the empire from interdimensional threats required ongoing maintenance by citizens whose training prepared them to serve as conscious participants in processes that operated beyond normal sensory perception, creating a democratic foundation for cosmic defense that distributed responsibility across entire populations rather than concentrating it in individuals whose elimination could compromise the security of everyone dependent on their unique capabilities, demonstrating that evolution toward higher forms of consciousness naturally produced social arrangements that were more stable and effective than those based on hierarchical concentration of essential functions. Marcus had often wondered during his lifetime whether the knowledge he preserved would prove relevant to challenges that might arise after his own death, but the continued use of his archives by succeeding generations of scholars and practitioners confirmed that wisdom gained through direct experience of cosmic conflict retained its value indefinitely, providing guidance that could be adapted to new circumstances while maintaining connection to eternal principles that governed the relationship between consciousness and the forces that shaped existence according to patterns too vast for any individual mind to comprehend completely, but accessible to communities whose collective understanding exceeded anything possible for isolated individuals, regardless of their personal capabilities. The peaceful atmosphere that pervaded the imperial city decades after the crisis reflected not just the absence of immediate threats, but the presence of positive influences that encouraged cooperation and mutual support among citizens whose enhanced awareness of their interconnectedness made conflicts based on purely selfish considerations seem both unnecessary and counterproductive, creating social conditions that supported continued development toward goals that required coordination between individuals whose different talents and perspectives could be synthesized into collective capabilities that exceeded the sum of their separate contributions. The international relationships that connected the empire to other regions of Tamriel continued to evolve as the lessons learned during the crisis influenced diplomatic approaches that emphasized shared responsibility for maintaining cosmic balance rather than competition for limited resources, demonstrating that consciousness possessed the capacity to transcend apparent conflicts of interest when participants understood their fundamental unity despite superficial differences in culture, history, or immediate circumstances that created illusions of separation, requiring resolution through methods that recognized underlying harmony rather than accepting surface discord as inevitable. In the gardens where Marcus had walked during his evening meditations, Flowers bloomed with enhanced beauty that reflected the subtle influence of cosmic energies that had become more accessible following the reconstruction of barriers between dimensions according to principles that allowed beneficial exchange while preventing harmful intrusion, creating environments that supported both physical health and spiritual development through exposure to influences that operated beyond normal sensory perception, but could be appreciated through intuitive awareness that developed naturally when consciousness learned to recognize its connections to forces that transcended material limitations. The children who played in these enhanced environments displayed capabilities that suggested the permanent improvements in human potential that had resulted from the Empire's successful navigation of cosmic crisis, demonstrating that evolutionary advancement could be achieved through collective response to challenges that required transcendence of previous limitations rather than gradual development over periods too extended for individual consciousness to witness the completion of processes that encompassed multiple generations working towards whose achievement required coordination between beings whose lifespans were brief compared to the cosmic cycles within which their contributions gained significance. As centuries passed, and the immediate memory of the Oblivion crisis faded into legend, the deeper truths that had been revealed during those crucial months continued to influence the development of consciousness throughout Tamriel and beyond, spreading through networks of communication and cultural exchange that carried wisdom, gained through cosmic conflict to regions where it could take root according to local conditions, while maintaining connection to universal principles that transcended cultural boundaries and provided guidance applicable to any situation requiring responses that combined individual courage with collective wisdom in service of purposes that extended beyond immediate considerations into realms where the welfare of entire universes could be influenced by choices made by beings whose humble origins provided no indication of their capacity to participate in processes that operated on scales encompassing dimensions beyond those accessible to normal perception. And in the deepest archives of the Imperial Library, carefully preserved for those who might need such knowledge in times yet to come, the complete record of those extraordinary days rests quietly like a gentle friend waiting to share its wisdom with anyone who seeks to understand how heroes are made and hope endures, even when the sky itself bleeds, and the boundaries between worlds grow thin as autumn leaves drifting toward Earth, where new stories wait to bloom from seeds planted by those who chose love over fear when the choice between them determined whether reality itself would survive to nurture the dreams of generations yet unborn.